It's a corporate festival almost as much as it's a sports festival. The problem with the Olympics, and more people are starting to figure this out around the world, is that the Olympics are an inequality machine. All of the unfair elements of a society that exist before the Olympics arrive intensify and exacerbate during the Olympic Games. The Olympics are tremendously popular so long as they're not happening in your city. And in fact, many people have said no to the Olympic Games. Between 2013 and 2018, around a dozen cities said no thank you to hosting the Olympic Games. There are a series of reasons, and these reasons pop up in city after city. The first one is overspending. The Olympics are supposed to cost so much, but inevitably they cost much more over time. Every single Olympics is like this. Whether you're talking about the Tokyo Olympics that were supposed to cost $7.3 billion and in the end costed about $30 billion, or whether you're talking about the Sochi Winter Olympics in Russia in 2014 that were supposed to cost $12 billion but ended up costing more than $50 billion. There's also the militarization of policing. So police and security units use the Olympics like their own private cash machine, getting all the special weapons and laws that they'd never be able to get during normal political times. I saw this with my own two eyes when I lived in Rio de Janeiro in the lead up to those Olympics in 2016, where some 85,000 security officials policed those games. I saw that for myself in London when I lived there before and during the 2012 Olympics, where they literally ratcheted missiles, surface-to-air missiles, on the top of apartment complexes. I talked to people who lived in those apartment complexes, and they were notified of this fact by having a little slip of paper put under their door that said, guess what? We're putting missiles on your roof. They were not very happy about it, as I'm sure you can imagine. A third way that the Olympics are an inequality machine is that they make worse, they intensify, they exacerbate gentrification and displacement of working class populations. For example, when I lived in Rio de Janeiro, some 77,000 working class favela residents were displaced by the Olympics. 77,000. In London, there were more than 1,000 people who were displaced by the Olympics. Another reason why people oppose the Olympics is because of greenwashing. The people who run the Olympics talk a big ecological game, but oftentimes their follow-through is extremely lacking. So when I lived in Rio de Janeiro, one of the big promises of Olympic organizers was that they were going to filtrate more than 80% of the water that flowed into Guanabara Bay, which was this highly polluted bay where they were going to hold events such as open water swimming and sailing. Unfortunately, they didn't do anything like that, and only around 25% or so of the water that flowed into the bay by the time the Olympics started was actually filtrated. Another reason why people oppose the Olympics is because of a lack of democracy. If the Olympics are a big deal for a city, as the International Olympic Committee always says that they are, well then people who will never be able to afford a ticket should get a say in whether the games happen. They should get to vote on whether they want to host the Olympics. That's just basic democracy. And people are upset that we're not even seeing basic democracy. There have been numerous alternatives to the Olympic Games. For example, in the 1920s and 1930s, there were something called the Workers' Games, where working class people from mostly Europe, but also other parts of the country, came together and participated in sport for fun. There were different levels of competition. Some were really serious athletes, some were, somewhat serious, and then some were just doing it totally for recreation and fun. There was a big one planned for 1936 in Spain, but the rise of the fascist regime under Francisco Franco scuppered that effort, and they were forced to not have those 1936 Barcelona Workers' Games. There was also these other games that were alternative Olympics called the Women's Olympics during that exact same time period. Because the Baron wished to exclude women from the Olympic Games, and because the International Olympic Committee went along with it, Very few women actually got to participate in the Olympics. It was a real struggle. So out of that exclusion was born ingenuity. And women created an alternative called the Women's Games in the 1920s and 1930s. And women participated and showed they were perfectly capable of engaging in sports. Members of the International Olympic Committee felt like women were too weak to engage in sports. Later on in the history of the Olympics, there was something called GANEFO, the Games of the Newly Emerging Forces, where in Indonesia, the leadership there thought it was ridiculous that the Olympics claimed to be apolitical, to have nothing to do with politics. So GANEFO, the Games of the Newly Emerging Forces, were a number of countries, mostly from the global south, that decided that the Olympics are political and our games are going to be very political. So they embraced politics, and it was an alternative in that sense. The Olympics are an exercise in extreme capitalism in some ways. And what I call this is celebration capitalism. Naomi Klein has this idea of disaster capitalism, and the idea there is that when there's a disaster that hits, oftentimes the architects of the economy turn to neoliberalism. They engage in deregulation. They privatize public goods. They let the market decide. They engage in financialization. So in that moment of peril, the people come and do those things. What I argue is with the Olympics, they're an example of what we might call celebration capitalism, the sort of whipsaw inverse of Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism. They share a lot of qualities of disaster capitalism and the neoliberalism that she talks about, but I argue it's also quite different than neoliberalism, because if neoliberalism is all about privatization, in some ways public money is almost always spent in enormous sums with the Olympic Games. And it's not about deregulation, it's actually quite often about highly intensified regulatory regimes that are put in place for the Olympic Games. Just look at the contracts around the sponsorship agreements. And so if you want to understand capitalism in the 21st century, the Olympics can be an extraordinarily instructive place to look. For the Olympics, the 1980s were a crucial decade. At that time, they were in crisis because the 1976 Olympics were an epic failure. For starters, the Montreal Games went way over budget. The mayor of Montreal at the time said that the Olympics would no sooner go over budget than a man would have a baby. But the Olympics went way over budget, from about $150 million that they expected it to be to well over $1 billion. Montreal didn't pay the debt until 2006, some 30 years after those Olympics. Also, the Winter Olympics in 1976 were initially awarded to Denver, but people across the political spectrum, from leftist environmentalists to conservatives that were concerned about fiscal spending, and they passed a referendum that said no public funding would go toward those 1976 Olympics, which forced the International Olympic Committee to move those Olympics from Denver into Innsbruck, Austria. So with that as a backdrop, the International Olympic Committee was in trouble, and along came the 1984 Olympics. At that time, there were only two serious bidders for the 1984 Olympics, Los Angeles and Tehran in Iran. But then there was the revolution brewing in Iran, which basically took Tehran off the table, leaving only Los Angeles. This gave Los Angeles incredible leverage over the situation, unprecedented leverage. And they put certain strictures on how they would put forward the games. And those included being able to bring in a number of corporate sponsors. So in the 1980s, as they got ready for the 1984 Olympics, Los Angeles organizers brought in huge corporate sponsors to pay millions of dollars to be a part of the Olympic brand. It worked. They actually made some money in Los Angeles. They hyper-commercialized the 1984 Olympics and brought in huge sums of corporate cash. The International Olympic Committee was watching carefully, and they said, oh, this is something we could also do. It's a corporate festival almost as much as it's a sports festival.